Shehan Jeyarajah joins us, CBS Sports. His article today, by the numbers, why Bill Belichick's UNC debut was a disaster for the ages at North Carolina. They had that opening drive, and they're going to look. Was that a reality check for everybody involved, from North Carolina to the media that thought this was going to be the next coming of Saban, and for Bill himself?
Well, I'll tell you what, that drive reminded me a lot of Colorado's first drive against TCU a couple of years ago. And I felt about the same about that Colorado game as I felt about North Carolina, that TCU was just going to come in and maybe wipe the floor with them. But yeah, I mean, I think that this was a huge reality check for North Carolina for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, look, TCU's going to be one of the better teams in the Big 12, but they're not necessarily a top 10 team. They're not necessarily a top 5 team. I mean, for goodness sake, North Carolina still has to play Clemson later this year. And I think that it just showed them how far away this team is in every phase of the game. My biggest red flag about this team heading into 2025 is that they just don't have a lot of playmakers on that roster. I think that they did an okay job of raiding the portal with Belichick coming in, but it's really not easy to just come in completely cold, not have any connections in college football, not have any connections in recruiting, and find guys who are going to be able to step up and really be big-time players at the power conference level. So I think you saw a team that was just frankly not talented enough, and that's my issue with North Carolina heading forward. I don't know if they're going to get more talented by the time the season comes to an end.
I'm kind of confused as to why North Carolina thought, or at least that was their PR mission, of we can turn this around in a year and be contenders, when North Carolina quite literally is never a contender in football in the ACC.
Well, hey, that's not fair. Marquise Williams happened back in 2015. I think all of us Baylor Bears remember that great team that Larry Fedora was OC on.
Oh my God, yeah.
that was a little while ago. But I do think that if you talk to people inside the building a little bit, which I haven't as much, some of my colleagues have, there's an understanding that this probably wasn't going to be back in the ACC title game this year, but there was optimism that this would be maybe a first step of a couple, right? Like this is maybe a 2-3 year flip. Well, this is looking like a roster that's nowhere close, right? Like this is looking like a roster that lost all of its best players. Obviously, Omarion Hampton now in the NFL, Howard Sampson, their top offensive lineman now at Texas Tech. And there's so many stories like that of guys who are very talented and just decided to go somewhere else because this new staff was coming in. And so I don't think that the people coming in at North Carolina realized when they put together this roster just how far away they were. I think that they thought, Mac Brown led them to a 6-7 record last year. We can probably do better than that. We can probably be a 7-8 win team, and then potentially a 10 win team next year, then potentially an ACC title contender in year 3. And maybe that's all you get out of Belichick. But this is a roster that looks like it actually could be one of the worst teams overall in the ACC. I mean, after a game like that, because I think coming into the year, North Carolina has one of the easiest schedules in the Power 4. Well, if you're this quality of team, suddenly no schedule is easy. All of a sudden, going on the road against Cal, that actually looks like a loss. Going on the road against NC State, that looks like a loss. All of a sudden, you start asking questions about your road game against UCF. All of a sudden, you start asking about that Stanford game. Is that going to be competitive? It just changes everything, I think, when you go from being maybe a lower class team to a bottom of the barrel type roster.
Shehan, coming out of the game out in Tallahassee, what were you more, confident about? Florida State's return to being a really good football team and maybe being a contender, or Alabama's downfall by their standards and maybe even by some other standards as well? Teetering there as a top 25 team at this point, and Georgia just about 3 weeks away.
Well, I think what's interesting about Alabama is that this is kind of a repeat of what happened last year, where they just could not take care of business against opponents that they, wouldn't consider the highest quality, right? They punched up. They beat Georgia last year, for example, but then they couldn't handle Vanderbilt. They couldn't handle Oklahoma. They weren't focused and ready for those games. And I view this as being a very similar situation of a very, very talented roster. People are pointing at the roster, there's nothing about the roster construction to me that's broken. what's broken is that these players just are not executing. The culture just doesn't look good in terms of on-field play. They're not running to the ball. I mean, you saw these clips floating around of defensive players jogging while, Florida State breaks off touchdowns, and it's just so un-Bama. So that's, I think, probably the biggest concern for me is, can you fix that over the course of a season? I will say on the Florida State side, look, they played really, really well. And I think what's most impressive about them is that they clearly have elevated themselves to at least be competitive in the trenches against some of these elite opponents. So if that's the case, because that was a huge issue for them last year, I think that transforms what this team can be a lot. I think you have to put them in that conversation with Clemson and Miami as top ACC contenders. And so I think that I came away probably feeling a little better about Florida State than worse about Alabama, but you just can't keep having these mental mistakes and errors.
You were at the game, Baylor and Auburn. You're Friday night. It was good to see you. Auburn was pretty good. I mean, they ran the ball. Were you surprised Baylor's defense basically was like soft toilet paper and stopping the run?
Yeah, I mean, when Jackie Marshall went out, it was kind of over from there. Like, Baylor just did not have anybody else at defensive end that they could rotate in. And, I think that there was some question right after losing Brandon Batt to the portal. Frankly, for somebody who follows this program closely, but not, with a fine-tooth comb, I didn't recognize a lot of the guys on their depth chart at defensive end because, again, those top end guys, some of the like edge rusher guys who are more stand-up linebackers, but at end, I just did not feel like they had many guys who I knew a whole lot about. And that sort of showed up in this game. They looked miserable once Marshall went out. And that's a huge issue. I mean, you look in this league, obviously not every team is going to be able to take advantage of you the way that Auburn did, but there are teams that will want to run the ball all over you. I think about that Utah game. I mean, Utah's offensive line is better than Auburn's, and they run the ball at a higher level than Auburn does. So all of a sudden, you're starting to ask questions about some of these games that felt like maybe manageable situations that become a little more daunting. So I'm curious how Dave Aranda approaches it. I think in reality, you can't sit there with 3 down linemen when one of your linemen is just such a negative the way that we saw in this game. So I'm curious if he goes to a 4 down front. I'm curious if he brings more, pressure towards the ball, if they play a safety down. I don't know what their plan is going to be, but clearly what happened against Auburn is just not sustainable when you're playing good offensive lines.
What do you think that means for them this week against SMU, who also has a mobile quarterback in Kevin Jennings?
Well, I think that there's a couple pieces of this. One, Jackson Arnold is very much a runner. Like, he wants to run. You saw in his best games, like, he was somebody who was primarily running. Kevin Jennings wants to be a pocket passer. He wants to sit back there and deliver passes. And so they'll use the mobile aspect of his game if they feel like they have to, but he'd prefer not to. It's not that he's not a willing runner, but he's much more scrambling to pass than he is to run. So I'll be curious if they work some of that into their game plan, though, because again, you saw the issues that Baylor had against Auburn. The other thing, though, too, is that SMU lost a couple of their key pieces on the offensive line to the NFL after their run to the college football playoff. So this is not going to be an Auburn level offensive line. So this is a big opportunity, I think, for Baylor's defensive line to come out and show that, hey, you know what, maybe we're just a little overmatched in that game, but it doesn't mean that we're structurally flawed, that we're that it's over necessarily for this rushing defense. But I mean, I mentioned this on the Waco Tribs podcast as well. Like, I just don't feel like Baylor's done a good enough job of developing defensive linemen over the past 2 or 3 years. I mean, since that sort of TJ Franklin, Gabe Hall, that, Apu Ika, since that group graduated, I don't feel like we've seen consistently high schoolers especially come in and develop into good players at Baylor. So, I mean, I think that's something to keep an eye on, but I don't think that SMU is going to be able to take advantage to quite the same extent. The difference is, though, is that they might actually be more dynamic and dangerous in the passing game.
Shehan, that's a loaded question, but there's just so many games in week 1, and we're also like trying to look ahead to week 2 as well. But we kind of touched on some of those mega matchups from last weekend. But of the 3 winners who now find themselves right there inside or just on the outside of the top 5, Miami, LSU, Ohio State. You pick one to talk about or fawn over or whatever that stood out to you most from last weekend.
Well, I picked LSU before the season to win the national championship, and I'm feeling pretty good about that right about now. I think that defensively, they were everything that I hoped that they'd be. Mansour Delane was a player I talked up a lot of the offseason at cornerback. He has an interception in the game, of course. He has a great game overall. I think that LSU's defensive line also rose to the occasion in so many ways. They found some good ways to use Harold Perkins without having to overdo it necessarily. And I was actually very, very impressed as well with the way that that LSU's offensive line held up against a really, really good Clemson defensive line. Now, some of that I felt like some of Clemson's defensive line was a little underwhelming in that game. Certainly something to keep an eye on, but I think that LSU very much looked the part of a national championship contender. They go in, they make plays in big moments, they actually go down, they don't panic, they live up to the moment, and ultimately come away with a 7-point victory that, frankly, could have easily have been more than that. I felt like that catch was a touchdown, the incredible Garrett Nussmeier pass.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, to be as dominant as they were, to outgain Clemson by as much as they did, they looked the part to me. And, I don't have an AP vote, but in our CBS 136, I voted them number 2 ahead of Penn State because I was so impressed with their performance.
Well, I was about to bring that up. I saw where you said your top 25. I didn't know if you were AP or not, but everyone can have a vote. And of course, you covered the game. When you put this all together, do you look at what the poll was for you last week, or do you change? Like, it's early, so there's not a lot of evidence. There's only like Tarleton State's 2-0, but I know they're not going to get ranked in a top 25. They're number 4 in the FCS. How do you go about, like a Ouija board? Everything just kind of goes in different places, eventually attaches?
Yeah, so look, because we do a full 136 ranking, and so the way that we do it is that if you rank all 136 teams before the season, you have to do a 136 every single week. So it's a lot of teams. Yeah, and I do that every single week. So and then I pull the top 25 of that and usually tweet that out. So I try to very much like you have to have some context for it, right? You can't just go A to Z in the alphabet and try to place every single team. But what I try to do is, if there are teams that generally have helped themselves or hurt themselves, like, I'll move them to the side for a second and I'll kind of slot them in a little bit later. But, especially at this point of the year, I really try to be very reactive. Like, Alabama was not my top 25. They haven't done anything at this point to deserve a top 25 spot. Even if you think that Florida State is a top 20 team, well, going on the road and losing by 2 touchdowns to a top 20 team, that's not necessarily going to get you in the rankings if you don't have that Crimson A on your helmet. And so ultimately, I think that, or I guess white A on a Crimson helmet, you know what I mean? But I think that for me, like, I try to be very reactive at the beginning because we come in with so many preconceived notions about this game. And I think that ultimately hurts our own understanding of the game. Like, for example, I still had Texas, I believe, at number 6, but like, you can't just be like, well, that was the number 1 team going on the road and losing, because they were number 1 based off of our own imaginations, essentially, at that point. And so I think you always want to be, very reactive early on. And that means that there are going to be teams that probably rank highly in my rankings that look silly by the end of the year. But that's kind of the point. We want to be reactive at this point.
Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports, with us every Tuesday in the 4:00 hour.
What did you think about South Carolina against Virginia Tech? They looked every bit, athletic and all those things. Lenora Sellers is a monster. Nick Harbor looks like he's finally learning how to be a wide receiver and not just an athlete, because that's what he was before. But Virginia Tech and Brent Pry, man, they just appear to be stuck in neutral a little bit. Like, they're not awful, but they're not really anything, right? And that's maybe more egregious than anything else.
Yeah, it was interesting. I felt really good about where they were at through the first 3 quarters of the game. And like, I don't think they had to win this game necessarily. South Carolina is the top 15 team, but the way that they just fully lost control of the game in the 4th quarter is just very disappointing to me. When you think of Virginia Tech, when you think of these teams, like, you think of teams that pull you down into a slog, that get stops in key moments. They're usually the team, right, that makes the big special teams play. They don't allow the big special teams play. That's just not Virginia Tech football. And so I think that that's what's the most disappointing thing, is that they've just been a team that feels like they've continued to lose and lose and lose and have attrition. And like, I know that when Brent Pry came in here and replaced Justin Fuente, he viewed it very much as a full-scale cultural rebuild, and we're going to build it up through high schoolers, and we're going to get old. But, last year they had high expectations. They completely fell on their face. This year they have lower expectations. And so, I think that it's possible that they fight and, get into some of these games. And I think that talent-wise, they pretty much held their own against South Carolina, which was impressive enough for me. But you just have to find a way to finish these games. And I'll tell you what, I don't think that the South Carolina game necessarily hurt matters, but I think that Brent Pry is going to find himself on one of the hotter seats in America if things don't turn around.
Shehan, real quick for you. I know we mostly looking back, but Oklahoma, Michigan, what's your gut feel on this game coming up?
Yeah, this is, I think, a big prove-it opportunity for Oklahoma. I think that they're the much more talented team. I think that they're the more complete team. My one big question about them, on the offensive line, even in their FCS game, didn't look especially good running the ball.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Michigan's going to be a team that gives you some trouble. So if it goes the way it should go, I think it's Oklahoma by 10 plus, but they really got to prove it in this game.
Last thing, you wrote about Sawyer Robertson leading up to the Auburn game. We just had Ari Tempkin on. He just seemed like, I don't know if he was tentative, but he didn't use part of what makes him special, running or taking off and trying to get those extra yards and move the sticks. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I did think that he looked a little tentative out there. Like maybe the moment was kind of getting to him a little bit. And he did look a little afraid of the pressure at times, whether it was pressure from rushers or whether it was, like you said, taking off and maybe getting hit. I don't know. It's interesting, right? Because I'm sure that they've told him, hey, you know what, Sawyer, like we don't want you to get hurt. You're too important to this team. And especially when they're having the success that they were having in the middle of the field, passing the ball. Obviously, I understand that. But, I think the other piece of it, too, is like you're in this fourth quarter game. It's a one-score game late. You have an opportunity to go and tie. Like, I think that there is an aspect of like, all right, you got to be willing to step up in that moment and take advantage of those moments. So, it was a tough first game for him. I think that obviously he was under pressure a lot, but I like that he found himself a little bit more in the third and fourth quarter. And while the beginning of the game, I think, was pretty brutal for him, I do think that people should still feel really good about him heading into week 2.
Shehan, thank you, buddy. Appreciate your time on Tuesdays in the 4 o'clock hour. Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports with us.